I first noticed it when I started apologizing for how I felt. Not for what I did. For what I felt. If something hurt, I said, I'm probably just being dramatic. If I cried, I said, ignore me, I'm too sensitive. If I reacted strongly, I added quickly, I know I overreact. He never called me emotional. He only smiled gently and said, you feel things very deeply. It sounded like a compliment. Until I realized it always came right before he explained why my feelings didn't make sense. He had a way of responding that made everything quiet. If I said something upset me, he'd nod slowly and say, I understand why you'd feel that way, but don't you think you're taking it a little personally? If I said I felt hurt, he'd sigh softly and reply, you're very sensitive today. Not angry. Not dismissive. Concerned. And suddenly, I was no longer talking about what had happened. I was explaining why my reaction might be wrong. The first time I doubted my own emotions, it scared me. Something small had happened, a comment, a look, a pause. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. I told him, carefully, that made me feel strange. He looked at me kindly. You've been stressed lately. I think everything feels bigger right now. The sentence landed gently. And immediately, relief followed. Of course. It wasn't real. It was me. Later that night, alone, the feeling came back. Just as strong. And the thought that followed made my breath stop. If my emotions are always the problem, then I never have to ask whether something else is wrong. The first thing I stopped trusting was my anger. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind. The kind that appears when something feels unfair, when a boundary has been crossed. If I felt it rise, I didn't say anything. I waited. Later, carefully, I'd ask him, can I tell you something? And you tell me if I'm being unreasonable? He always agreed. I'd explain the situation. He'd listen thoughtfully. And then, almost always, he'd say, I don't think they meant it that way. Sometimes he added, you're very intuitive, but this time I think your feelings are reacting to something else. And just like that, the anger faded. Not because it was resolved. Because I no longer trusted it. After that, every emotion needed confirmation. If I felt jealous, I asked, am I imagining this? If I felt hurt, I asked, do you think I'm being too sensitive? If I felt uneasy, I asked, is this actually a problem or is it just me? He never said I was wrong. He just explained why I might be. You're projecting. You're overthinking. You're tired, that's all. Sometimes he was right. Sometimes he wasn't. But soon, something dangerous happened. I stopped asking what I felt. I started asking what he thought I should feel. The moment I realized how far this had gone came one afternoon when something truly upset me. Not dramatic. Just clear. A boundary. A promise. A small betrayal. The hurt came fast and sharp. And instead of reacting, I reached for my phone. Not to tell a friend. Not to write it down. To ask him. Before the message sent, I froze. Because I realized something that made my hands shake. I wasn't trying to understand my emotions. I was trying to get permission. To have them. The first time he said it, he laughed. Not mockingly. Lightly. I had been explaining why something hurt me, slowly, carefully, already minimizing half of it. He listened, then smiled and said, "You know, that doesn't really make logical sense." The word stayed in the air. Logical. I blinked. "What do you mean?" He shrugged gently. "I'm just saying, if you look at it objectively, there's no real reason to feel that way." Objectively. The sentence felt clean. Smart. Reasonable. And suddenly, my emotion felt embarrassing. Like I had misunderstood a rule everyone else knew. After that, logic became the language of every conversation. If I felt upset, he asked, "But what's the actual evidence?" If I felt anxious, he said, "Let's break this down rationally." If I felt hurt, he replied, "Emotionally, I get it. But logically?" Always that pause. That quiet invitation to abandon my feelings. And join him on safer ground. Sometimes, by the end of the conversation, I nodded and said, "You're right." Not because the pain was gone. Because I could no longer defend it in his terms. The moment it truly settled and happened one night when I cried over something small. Not dramatic. Just tired. Overwhelmed. He watched me for a moment, then said softly, "You know, you often react emotionally before thinking." The sentence wasn't cruel. It was diagnostic. Like a description of a flaw I hadn't known I had. I wiped my face quickly. "I'm sorry. I know this is irrational." The word slipped out easily. Too easily. Later, alone, I replayed the moment again and again. And the thought that finally appeared made my stomach turn. If my feelings are not logical, then maybe they are not trustworthy. And slowly, without noticing, I began to treat my own emotions. Not as signals, but as errors. That needed to be corrected. The first emotion I learned to correct was sadness. Not hide. Rewrite. If I felt it coming, I stopped and asked myself questions the way he would. Is this really that bad? Am I being fair? Would a reasonable person feel this way? Sometimes, by the time the feeling reached the surface, it was already diluted. Smaller. Quieter. Acceptable. If I still decided to speak, I prepared the explanation first. "I know this is probably irrational, but..." "I might be overthinking, but..." "This is silly, but I feel..." Every sentence began by apologizing for existing as an emotion at all. Soon, I started editing reactions in real time. If something surprised me, I softened it. If something hurt, I smiled first. If something angered me, I waited until the anger sounded calm enough to survive logic. Sometimes, I felt the emotion clearly, and then watched myself dismantle it piece by piece. "No, that's not fair. No, that's too extreme. No, you're missing context." Until what remained wasn't a feeling anymore. Just a conclusion. The moment I realized what I had done came during a conversation that should have been simple. He said something careless. Not cruel. Just thoughtless. I felt the familiar sting. And immediately, the process began. He didn't mean it. You're tired. This isn't important. Don't overreact. By the time I spoke, my voice was steady. "I think I misunderstood you," I said. He nodded, relieved. "Yeah, that's probably it." And suddenly, something inside me broke very quietly. Because I realized something terrifying. I hadn't misunderstood him. I had understood him perfectly. I had just learned to mistranslate myself. The realization came in a moment so ordinary it almost slipped past me. We were talking about something small. Nothing emotional. Nothing important. He said something that didn't sit right. Not cruel. Just wrong. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. And before he could say a word, I corrected myself. Out loud. "Oh, never mind," I said quickly. "I'm probably just misreading it." He blinked. I didn't even respond yet. The room went very quiet. And suddenly, I understood something that made my hands go cold. I wasn't waiting for him to explain my feelings anymore. I was doing it for him. After that, I started noticing it everywhere. I apologized before anyone disagreed. I doubted myself before anyone questioned me. I rewrote memories before anyone challenged them. Sometimes I'd feel hurt. And immediately feel ashamed for feeling hurt. Sometimes I'd feel angry. And immediately search for reasons why I was wrong. One night, alone, I whispered something into the dark that finally scared me. I don't know which of my feelings are real anymore. And which ones I've trained myself to delete. I don't tell this story because he manipulated me. He did sometimes. But not the way people imagine. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't deny reality. Didn't tell me I was crazy. He only taught me one dangerous idea. That emotions must always make sense. Before they are allowed to exist. And I admired him enough to start enforcing that rule. On myself. The quiet truth I live with now is this. The most powerful form of control is not when someone tells you what to think. It's when they teach you not to trust what you feel. Because once you start correcting your own emotions, no one has to gaslight you anymore. You'll do it perfectly on your own.